Dans le monde actuel, il y a un bilan de tragique ineptie devant lesquels il est impossible de rester indifférent. Mais le peintre ressent trop de reconnaissance envers ce que la vie lui a accordé pour sombrer dans la fureur. Et je pense que s'il y a un lien entre toutes ces œuvres, c'est un courant de compassion et d'espoir.
Exactly where it comes from, I don't think I could say, and I'm certainly not going to try to define what it is. It's more interesting to look at what this freedom can do, and the principal advantage of this attitude is that you can feel at ease, and you can feel interest, and you can feel full of good exchange, whether you're in a hovel or a palace. Finally, the value of the human being that you meet is the only thing that is of any great importance. It cuts through every kind of nationalistic generalization, which is pretty well useless in any case. One person after the other, and in every country in the world that I've visited, I've met individuals of the most marvelous completion, and also crowds that inevitably make me afraid. The concept of a stranger everywhere is linked to questions of identity. I have some experience of this as a New Zealander, because in my youth, the musicians, poets, painters, writers of Christchurch were my friends, and all of us were quite strongly engaged in the search for a New Zealand identity. This New Zealand identity, after a while, seemed to me to boil down to trying to find, as far as possible, differences from other cultural identities. I was too young at the time to grasp the fact that we simply had everything to gain by accepting our past and using as much patience as possible for the sweet, for what follows. The degree to which the land, the islands in which I was born, were influences is something that I've given a good deal of thought to now, but of course didn't consider at all during my actual youth. The physical land in the part of the North Island of New Zealand where I was born was highly volcanic in formation, which inevitably gave rise to questions, and especially having found out the name of the town in which I was born, which is called Taihape, which in Maori indicates broken or disturbed waves. And this is exactly the right term to describe the broken rippling of the hillside, the countryside all round this village, leading up towards the three volcanoes in the center of the island, which were visible from the upper floor of the house. This countryside was very full in vibratory terms, in volcanic terms, in surprising terms, but the emptiness culturally from a European point of view was of course made very evident and greatly accentuated by the manner in which my father directed our education. The house was filled with books and pictures, every kind of culture, every invitation was present to generate a world interest. And the richness of this world interest and the emptiness of this world influence in this extraordinary landscape meant that without knowing it, I was in a strange kind of pressure cooker, I suppose. But this is like everything else. Lack is the motivation for dreams of every kind. And people who lack nothing and who can dream of nothing run the danger of being desperately bored and wasting their entire life. I think educationally it's indispensable to lack somewhere. Otherwise, your imagination can't evolve. You can't put your heart into something that you haven't badly wanted. And this may be one of the big disadvantages of the youth of the present time, who in some respects have been a bit spoiled with too much gadgetry, too much mental blockage of technology, and not enough simple observation and enjoyment of life as it can be. The thing that attracted me in the first place, professionally, I needed to see these paintings from the past. I needed to see how they were done. I needed to see what they looked like in reality, not just in reproduction. And attached to all that are all of the other aspects of an ancient civilization, in other words, a long expressed experience. The way buildings are formed, the harmony of these buildings among each other, are a very different matter from the houses in New Zealand which are dumped anywhere that is convenient, but has no relation to the nature of the land or the need for water or defense. All of these things that have created a country like France and a city like Paris are part of the experience that I wanted to have. And to have that experience, you have to become part of it. So, struggling with the language, understanding the people, making friendships, making contact at last with the paintings that meant a great deal to me. All of this is among the deepest centers of an awareness, and this awareness is something that commands everything else. And it makes it all the clearer that being a stranger everywhere is by no means a punishment. It's an enormous advantage. I enjoy unfamiliar circumstances. I enjoy places I've never visited before. I'm quickly at ease in these places, but that doesn't mean to say that I'm anything but a stranger in these places. They also convince me that probably a lot of people would benefit from the experience of being a foreigner somewhere, because it alters all of your preconceived notions. It brings you right up against the fact that people are the same, exactly the same, everywhere. The human body is so constructed that the needs of every human being are practically identical, and the way these different needs are wrapped up in different customs and localities is nothing more nor less than fascinating, totally fascinating. So that being a stranger everywhere has every advantage, nothing to be feared of. There are people who say, but how brave of you to have gone off so young to a country that you didn't know. But of course that's nonsense. I was delighted to be where I was, and still am. The word choice came up in what we were saying. Choice is a very interesting subject. To what extent one chooses, I'm never quite sure. I'm never quite sure whether we do this and that because we've chosen it or because we have no choice. We're pushed. There's something that requires satisfaction. There's something that requires an answer. And in any case, choosing, and in my case, it wasn't choosing, it was a sense of adventure, a sense of appetite. I wanted to get to the world that my father made clear to me, having done his studies in Edinburgh and knowing the outer world, filled my imagination very early, so that in that sense there wasn't very much choice going on. There was an appetite that was created, and even if it had been a choice, the forces of hazard are strongest of all. Whatever we choose, the luck of the game is forcing us to adapt constantly to results that are different from what we imagined. These chances that are modifying us constantly make any kind of simple, stable statement impossible. We are vibratory creatures, open the whole time to chances requiring this adaptation. We were talking about experience and the accumulation of experience and 50 years here and so on. 50 years is a lifetime, and so becoming part of this experience is one thing, but you don't snake-like cast off your former skin. People who don't know France and the French as well as I do might say, you must be completely French by now. But of course I'm not completely French by now and never will be. And I'm constantly struck by the way French people find my point of view completely strange, because it's not based on the same first few years of life. And some people enjoy this unfamiliarity, others are disturbed by it. That's a personal matter, but from my point of view, I can't have enough different races. I find them all absolutely fascinating. And there are always things to learn from a different series of experiences. My experience in France has put me at ease here, but as I've said quite often in conversation before, I will and can never forget that I'm a New Zealander, but I do often forget that I'm not French, that I'm constantly brought up to realize the fact that I'm not French by reactions everywhere, and my accent in French will never be completely convincing. My hopes for being a spy in the next war are completely lost. Everything in everyday life, as far as my experience shows, is reflected in paint. And just as when I'm working on a picture, the first one is making contact, a mere making of contact. And little by little, what I'm looking for comes through, with the result that by the time I've got somewhere near what I'm trying to do, I'm less interested in the previous stages. And this is much the same with looking into my past. My past is made up of so many different chapters, so many different stages, but all working in this same sense. I notice when I'm showing pictures to people, they're all, or mostly, looking for a way in, because what they finally see from me isn't the first contact always, but something that's been worked on in terms of my sensibility and what I'm trying to say and what I feel. This is the same with looking back onto my past. Childhood, adolescence, leaving New Zealand, coming to France. All of this is packed with experience that goes from the most ecstatic to the most anguishing. Not necessarily of great interest to talk about, but once again it leads me to now, because whatever the past amounts to is what I am now and what I can do now, little as that may be. But it certainly has the same dependence on the first contact. And of course the first contact in the land of one's birth is largely concerned with personal relationships and the people who formed you, meant something to you, and yet the natural landscape on which you grow up has a very great effect, more than can be easily measured. So, looking into my past leads me to, first of all, the question that's constantly occurring among New Zealanders: what is a New Zealander? What does it mean to be a New Zealander? I have no easy answer to that, except for one or two very general observations. And one of them may be, to begin with, a certain liberty of attitude. Although to what degree this is something that I got directly from a very large visioned father is impossible for me to know. But I do notice in a general sense, although things like caste exist in New Zealand, we are not caste bound. And this freedom is very valuable because it means that we can, with luck, run into a very great variety of experience because we're not cut off in advance. The fact of, I suppose this liberty that we refer to is largely an inner matter, because wherever we are, there are rules and regulations, and in New Zealand, in my youth, these were a good deal firmer than they are now, as everywhere. I think it's hard to be able to judge what the youth of these days of extreme laxity and extreme permissivity will run to. If it allows them to, at some stage, get a good grip of themselves, then it's not wasted. One of the things of the discipline of my past was that it gives you something to bite on when you are trying to come to grips with yourself. The difficulty is that openness of mind requires unrelenting effort, like loving or painting, which provides my basic rhythm of questioning every stage of a theme. This endless questioning of a theme is what provides the whole adventure, and there's no end to it. To talk about patience, perhaps we should begin by mentioning passion, which never quits the scene of fashion for very long. And maybe patience would get better popularity if it could be considered as a kind of blood relation of passion. Nothing more than patience takes us closer to the absolute. Ask any parent of a hostage to religious extremists, also back in fashion right now. Meanwhile, how many parents are quietly coping with a mentally deficient child? In the course of a stint of work, which I undertook some years ago to correct the weakness of some personal misery, I found myself visiting, for instance, a family, mother and father and 20-year-old girl, mentally deficient. At worst, I imagined I would find them dumb with gloom, and at best, apathetic with some sort of saintly resignation. I was tremendously surprised to find them sprightly, absolutely glowing with gratitude for this girl, whom they swore taught them everything they ever knew about what life is worth living for. However that may be, the acquisition of patience and its maintenance fills an entire lifespan and takes on personal tonalities to an infinite degree. Nature. My first reaction is awareness to the extraordinary capacity nature has for taking over completely. This might be something to do with an ancient heritage that's been around for a long time, because even Vedic sources have warned us, never trust nature, it's never simple. This impotence in the face of nature throws a slight on man's godlike creativity and also underlines the unpleasant fact that we seem to need horrendous disasters to reopen a sense of generosity. I can't help wondering if the ancient Egyptians were rewarded with a greater degree of balance through having given animal heads to their gods. We've spent centuries of trying to repudiate our share of animality, with the result these days that we're under a weight of pathology that could well bring our whole civilization snivelling to a halt. I suppose a good deal of the complication began from the time that humankind has invested human feelings into every inhuman force in the planet. In a technological world, it's not surprising that people's nerves are largely shot to hell. The accent is on speed in every direction. And with speed and superficiality taking over, how can people learn to live fully, to develop resistance? The television doesn't teach young people anything about resistance. The accent is on sensation. Then above all, there's the joy of being able to forget natural disasters and the mixed blessing of mankind, and to stride out into the beautiful exuberance of that other nature, wherever it still exists. It represents the force motivating the work of endless painters and others engaged in the work of trying to express the impossible. The story has it that at some remote area we came down from our trees, where presumably everything was shared among the fittest, of course, and spread over plains where the first crops were grown. Since these first crops appeared, we've never known a day's peace. A mouthful of oats or wheat doesn't present much more energy than it takes for getting rid of it. Grains have to be bashed at and heated so that through a long process of evolution, it's not surprising that our word work comes down from Indo-European sources through various Germanic mutations into every kind of suggestion of effort and expensive of energy. The word for work in French, travail, adds a still further finesse. It comes from a late Latin word, trepalium, meaning an instrument of torture. But to return to those first crops, they would seem to be at the source of a lot of our fuss and bother. There comes a time when somebody has to count the stuff. It could never have been easy to make a fair distribution. And so with personal ambition coming into the picture and commerce rising from that, we have an added stable occupation, which is war. It's probable that each period of history has considered itself as the acme of human potential. And so perhaps in ours we consider ourselves as special prize winners, in the sense that the atmosphere has never been so thick with pollution from our work, and the din of our doubts as to the course of our general progress. Experience convinces me of the hopelessness of trying to compress the human spirit into a system, as religions all seem condemned to have to try. In all of the major religions, there are fragments from which the individual can go to work to construct a life. But as only a few individuals are prepared to go to this trouble, the rest gang together under one more all-size-fits-all formula, which proceeds to prove nothing simpler than that one size doesn't fit all. Economic pressures of our time react on a worldwide basis with unprecedented speed, a prime cause of destruction of the work ethic. Work today is becoming a disposable commodity, so disposable that corporations use this procedure shamelessly. Retrenchment has grown into a smart technique. Is there an alternative solution so that the organization of working hours is not restricted to automatization or irrational profits? Each person's work is his or her identity card into the community. For my part, perhaps the principal work of a lifetime is to forge loyalty to the structure in which we live, and yet to maintain some liberty from it, to question everything and to accept that final answers are unlikely. It's very foolish not to be able to say, I don't know. Highest among benefits from the workplace, I would put friendship. The friendship that comes from shared activity, shared interests, reciprocity. Friendship is finally the sole true religion, let's call it, which can work at making the human being as fully human as possible, rather than aiming high, too high, with disastrous consequences everywhere. The word isolation itself comes from a late Latin form of insula, meaning an island. And already by the early 17th century, the English poet John Donne famously declared, "No man is an island." Then by about mid-century, mid of the 19th century, the notion circulates that anything that separates people from other people is a mischievous wall of partition. My personal experience has not had to endure prolonged isolation, but I have to admit that at times when my work was not selling, I did feel a painful sense of isolation. The evidence of my painting not being able to reach out to others filled me with a debilitating sense of doubt. But if these passages through professional isolation were enough to give me an experience of despair or an idea of the ordinary hatred that society reserves for those who are in any way different, I think destiny has been hardest on anybody who has never known isolation in any form. Not to have been face to face with who one is at some stage makes for a life of blockage somewhere. The more I think about isolation, the more at the heart of it I would place communication. Even the religions didn't muff this one. The New Testament comes up with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God." It's a pity that some generalized shout of Amen never took place at that time of beginning, which may have allowed things to evolve more naturally than they have, even to the extent of understanding that the Word can be as benevolent or treacherous as any god. This duality, the Vedic writings made startlingly clear at an even earlier period. The survival of undeveloped people, so-called, which is at stake, along with the hopeless destruction of cultural heritage painstakingly adapted to geographic requirements. We are finally faced with one colossal paradox. On one hand, isolation punishment. On the other, the breakdown of world isolation, providing the completest demonstration of all time that literacy is no guarantee for intelligence. One thing that strikes the observer in this context is the manifest wish to increase isolation as a means of further gain and political manipulation. Information nourishes fear, which in turn publicity exploits by luring us into the dazzling world of consumerism. Progress. It must take an invincible spirit of youth to put one's faith in progress. It's not so much that there is no progress anywhere, but mostly that what passes for progress is really only the latest fad and quickly proved pretty well worthless. The book of Genesis should have been used in some way as a kind of warning. Danger, progress suspected. The book of Genesis is, after all, a very early illustration of consumer society and its reverses. Ever since then, Adam's apple has been associated with fornication, with the result that by now people are pulling at strings to fornicate everywhere. But where on earth do you have to go to get a decent apple? Progress has brought us apples withered and dried up with congelation. In terms of years lived, I am old, and so for many, this will make anything I have to say worthless, particularly those people for whom speed and the gadgetry of the present day have rendered blind to the poetry in life. It also means that speed and gadgetry has largely banished the human hand. There are crowds of people who never use the hand for much more than one finger commanding twinkles and flashes and small whirring noises from a sleek little bundle of sophisticated chips held in hand. These toys and mobile telephones are probably one of the reasons for increasing lack of cohesion in society. For instance, how not be struck by the amount of money many people, young, orphan, can spend on the searching out ever stronger, stranger, more violent sensations. I'm not convinced that this is what progress promises, which should be in terms of a better life. Were I to concoct a new form of algebra, it would begin facility equals rottenness. And now, faced with the facility-producing feats of technology, what can the old do? Performance is now the aim in itself. And as usual, television gives us hourly illustrations of substance on a mournfully low level, but with unparalleled brilliance, let's add. The speed factor in time compression, of course, means that whole societies are getting sickened with superficiality. There's no longer any time for work to be properly done, no longer time for families to meet and talk and learn how to make the best of things. As a natural course of this time compression, no time to do anything, it becomes very much harder for people to work scrupulously. And not working scrupulously, we grow poorer. We grow poorer in every way, no matter what there should be in a bank. A small number of people control the world through economics, and just as religions have always done, control through manipulation and power. Technology, in this case, follows a respectable tradition.
Looking into this preoccupation of the compression of time reveals, of course, a sort of anesthesia rising from the enormity of the commercial market. The once humble yogurt, which one bought without thinking more than I need a yogurt, now is part of a weighty commercial business in a supermarket, shelf after shelf, filled with so many brands and tints and tendencies that more time than one imagines goes in simply making one's choice. This mass consumerism vampirizes our time, whether we wish it or not. Learning to stop. There are hordes of people alive who continue to eat too much, want too much, accumulate too much, shrug their shoulders too much, and don't seem to realize that compressing time at this speed is the best way of waking up too late to live. Communicative techniques are improved extraordinarily, but there isn't much consideration given to what is communicated. The result is that the young are now liberated into making money even more blindly than the old. What time have they to gain the experience, to compare with what is valid and what is not? How can they imagine that this speed insistence erodes civilization and resistance? Meanwhile, the soggy undermass of humanity drifts into the violence of misery and frustration. Of course, it's easier to point out faults than to make positive suggestions as to what could be done. I suppose the only reasonable, feasible thing is to examine one's own attitude. In other words, to choose the texture of living which allows you to get as near as possible to what your potential contains. Speed, where necessary, must not do without the brain or ignore the symphony of the gut. In all of this, of course, it was even more important for me to feel that I could escape the imprisonment of a definition. I didn't want to be defined as this or that. I wanted to be free. But fully to embrace a life of freedom finishes by dumping you on a bed of roses, which, as anybody who's tried it will agree, is excruciatingly uncomfortable. But as I'm still alive and working hard and finding work indispensable to my well-being, I conclude that the principle is healthy. One would have to be mentally deficient, of course, to imagine that there will ever be some sort of ground plan leading to an ideal society. There's little chance that human fragility will suddenly blossom into instinctive consideration for others. In the meantime, if we can only admit that we're all animals, a minimum of respect can start to come about. And we would do well to remember that in the context of innate sickness in human society, we can must extract health and balance in order for a happier proportion of people to be able to get on with what should be the simplest possible activity, offering our best in every circumstance.